Hello everyone, this is Mr. Millette with an AP European History presentation. Today's presentation is about European society after the Cold War, to include its many demographic, societal, economic, and political transitions between 1991 and the present. One thing you may notice about the learning objectives below is that they are situated in either the time periods following World War I or World War II in European history. Throughout this presentation, we will revisit some of the developments and events from those time periods in an effort to understand their reach into the post-Cold War era of European history. At any rate, these are the learning objectives that will be addressed throughout this presentation. One challenge for historians has been articulating an historical narrative for post-Cold War European societies. Nearing 30 years since the failure of communism in Eastern Europe, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the economic and political liberalizing between Eastern and Western Europe, historians are challenged by how to tell Europe's contemporary story. In the year 2000, just 9 years after the Cold War, historian Palmira Brummett wrote, "During the 1990s, Moscow was no longer the center of a world empire. The end of the Soviet Bloc and the subsequent breakup of the Soviet Union itself gave birth to more than 20 diverse new nation-states. These states span the political spectrum from dictatorship to democracy and the spectrum of social conditions from freedom to repression. The end of the Cold War removed from the world the nightmare of bipolar nuclear annihilation, yet some commentators have begun to look back on the Cold War with some nostalgia as a time when there was a dependable order. The tearing down of the Berlin Wall, the overthrow of the Eastern European communist governments, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union with the transition to the Russian Federation all seem to feed into a general global attitude of optimism and good feelings. And in some ways, that optimism may have played out for Europeans over the past 30 years. But even in the year 2000, Brummett wrote about the Cold War's dependable order, almost as if it was something that was lost on Europe and the world just 9 years after the end of the Cold War. The uncertainty of a new Russian Federation's economic, political, and military future, the uncertainty of the political and economic future of Eastern Europe's former Soviet satellites, the uncertainty of the continued economic prosperity of Northern and Western European states, the uncertainty of Europe as a continent with an enhanced global political and economic status, and the uncertainty of the consequences of a more unified Europe may challenge historians to write such an optimistic historical narrative since 1991. This presentation will focus on 1. The transition of post-Cold War Europe, things about migration, demography, diversity, gender, and globalization. And secondly, this presentation will focus on 1991 to present, a time of unity or a time of disunity, as we attempt to respond to that and attempt to piece together, potentially, the narrative of post-Cold War Europe. For most of Europe's modern history, that is since 1492, the European continent has been a source of outbound immigration. Throughout the world, between 1492 and 1750, large waves of European migrants from Spain, England, and other nations flocked to the colonies of the Western Hemisphere. And in that time period, some even established small European settlements in the trade posts and colonies of the Eastern Hemisphere. Then, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Europeans fled urban crowding, lack of economic opportunity, religious and political persecution for job opportunities in North America. Beyond that, the age of imperialism helped to orchestrate significant European settlement in colonies in British South Africa and Australia and French Algeria, as Europe continued to be a source of outbound immigration. However, later in the 20th century and through the post-Cold War era, Europe stopped being the source of outbound immigration and transitioned to become the recipient of inbound immigration. Here are some of the pull factors that have brought people into Europe since the latter half of the 20th century. Economic success in Europe during and after decolonization in Asia and Africa. Benefits of the European welfare state, which are extended to immigrants who are employed and pay taxes in European states. The relative ease of entry and mobility into and within Europe with the European Union and the pre-existing Schengen Agreement from 1985, which eliminated a lot of the border checks for continental European states. Outside of Europe, there have existed many push factors for people leaving their Asian and African societies, and those push factors include former African and Asian colonies who faced political and economic instability and uncertainty. Former colonists of European descent, quote, return, end quote, to Europe so as to not live under newly formed independent governments. And more as of late, ISIS and the refugee crisis in the Middle East led to many Muslims seeking asylum in European states. Historically, one of the factors that has contributed to Europe's transitioned role in global immigration was the dozens of new nations that were formed in the latter half of the 20th century. After World War II, European empires, such as the English and the French, began to dissolve through varied processes of decolonization. Decolonization occurred over the course of the century with varying degrees of cooperation or resistance from European imperialist states. Asian and African colonies achieved their independence, as in the cases of Indian independence from England under the direction of Mahatma Gandhi, or Vietnamese independence from France under the direction of Ho Chi Minh, or Ghanaian independence from England under the direction of Kwame Nkrumah, and Kenyan independence from England under the direction of Jomo Kenyatta. The varied processes of decolonization in the newly established independent states and their new governments dictated, in part, some of the push factors present in Asia and Africa for people to migrate into Europe in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Cooperative and negotiated independence occurred in India and Ghana, but for a place like South Asia, with the religious, ethnic, and nationalistic differences between Indian and Pakistani societies, many Indian and Pakistani peoples migrated to England in the years after independence. Many West African peoples have also migrated into England, especially those that either lived under or their parents lived under English colonial rule in places like Ghana and Nigeria. In places like Kenya, Vietnam, and Algeria, the process of decolonization was characterized by more resistance from the European imperialist nations, and subject colonial peoples had to fight for their independence. The French lost Algeria in North Africa and Indochina in Southeast Asia after those places succeeded in their wars of independence. In effect, many westernized peoples from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos fled the communist regimes that were established in Southeast Asia and settled into France's cities. Likewise, many Algerians and peoples from former French West Africa settled in France. Those settlement patterns have continued and in some cases increased since 1991. Immigration into Europe has certainly changed the demographic and cultural landscape of the continent. Some of the most evident effects of inbound immigration to Europe have been the establishment of ethnic enclaves within major cities in Europe. For example, Vietnamese and Cambodian enclaves in France's cities, West African enclaves in London and Paris, Syrian, Afghan, and other Middle Eastern and Islamic enclaves in London, Paris, Brussels, and Berlin, and Indian and Pakistani enclaves in London. Inbound immigration to Europe has also increased the ethnic and religious diversity in Europe, and in effect, Many nativists have given rise to anti-immigrant political parties in Europe, such as France's National Front, once known as the National Rally, led by the Le Pen family. With such large inbound immigration to Europe, Europe now deals with several intensified issues, such as increased racial and ethnic tensions within Europe, the strain on European welfare states, especially in England, Sweden, and Germany, and the discrimination and suspension of civil liberties against Islamic enclaves as a reaction to the recent terrorist attacks in places like France. Middle Eastern and North African migration into Western Europe long preceded the end of the Cold War, but over the past decade, more and more Muslims have settled into Europe's largest cities. On this slide, you can see the East London Mosque in London, England, which serves a significant Muslim population in London today. The United Kingdom is home to some 2.6 million Muslims today. France has also been a recipient of Islamic migration for decades, but has experienced increased Islamic migration over the past decade, especially for Muslims that have fled the conflict caused by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, otherwise known as ISIS, in the Middle East. On this slide, you see an image of the Grand Mosque of Paris, in Paris, France. Today, France is home to some 4.2 million Muslims. Germany has also become a refuge for Muslims fleeing ISIS over the past decade, and in effect, Muslim enclaves have emerged throughout German cities. In this photo, you can see the Berlin Mosque in Berlin, Germany. Today, Germany is home to some 4.5 million Muslims. In 2015, Europe experienced quite the migrant crisis as refugees from North Africa and the Middle East poured into European states, fleeing the violence caused by ISIS in the regions. This new wave of refuged migrants compounded some of the issues that were already present with regards to migration to and within Europe, such as the great internal migration of Southern and Southeastern European peoples fleeing economic problems and migrating to the more prosperous Northern and Western European states. You can see on the map that Germany and France were two of the largest recipients of migrants coming from the Middle East and North Africa. Germany and some of the Scandinavian states have also absorbed Muslim refugees and Southern and Southeastern Europeans, and these migration patterns have caused concern about the strain on the welfare states of these more northern European states. In effect, both citizens and political leaders have called for limiting the number of migrants into their states so as to avoid the great cost of absorbing them into their welfare states. It has become a politically contentious point in places that have typically been welcoming to migrants. On the one hand, as long as immigrants get and hold jobs, they pay taxes into the welfare state, and in return receive the benefits of health care and education. On the other hand, the massive increase of immigrants exceeds the needs of the European job markets and poses a real threat to the potential bankrupting of Europe's welfare states. On this slide, you can see the nations that many of the immigrants are fleeing from, as indicated in the size of the red circles. Notice the largest red circles come from war-torn areas of the Middle East and economically struggling places from Southeastern Europe. The destinations, indicated in light blue, are the member nations of the European Union. The EU has virtually no barriers to travel and migration within and among its member states. And with economic problems in Southeastern Europe and conflict in the Middle East, these member states have become the target destinations for people fleeing poor conditions. This map indicates the percentages of immigrants living in the different regions and nations around the world. As you can see, immigrants make up as much as 10% of some of the European nations' populations as of 2015. During the 20th century, Europe's demographics changed considerably. Paralleling the demographics of the United States, Europe also experienced population growth after World War II. A baby boom happened in many European states, as it did in the United States, and today, as those boomers are in their retirement age, they make up a considerably large portion of Europe's population. After World War II, as more European governments transitioned to follow Scandinavian welfare state practices, governmental policies were enacted to correlate with and contribute to Europe's initial baby boom. For example, policies that provided benefits for childcare, maternity leave, and pronatal financial incentives to couples who had children encouraged the baby boom. However, later in the 20th century, the children and grandchildren of Europe's boomers were having fewer children, if any at all. In fact, Europeans were marrying less later in the 20th century than they were after World War II, and that has also directly impacted Europe's downward fertility rates. As second wave feminism impacted European societies between the 1960s and 1970s, more women earned college degrees, became employed in professional careers, and either postponed marriage and pregnancy or abandoned those altogether. In fact, Europe has experienced a significant decline in marriages and a significant incline in divorces over the past 50 years. Since the late 20th century, low fertility rates due to women having fewer children has been referred to as Europe's baby bust, as opposed to the baby boom that took place after World War II. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, increased access and use of contraception and birth control have contributed to Europe's continued baby bust. Some demographers also believe that the relative economic stagnation and recession over the past generation has also contributed to Europe's baby bust. In response, many of Europe's governments have actually extended financial incentives for couples having more children, increased infant and child care access and affordability, increased maternity leave and added paternity leave, and a host of other pronatal policies to combat the baby bust of current times. On this slide, you can see a graph that tracks the crude marriages and crude divorces over 50 years between 1965 and 2015. Within the European Union's member states, the crude marriage rates have reduced in half over the measured 50 years, and the crude divorce rates have doubled over the 50-year period. Keep in mind, between the 1960s through the 1980s, second wave feminism was taking place, and Europe's values regarding marriage, family, and having children were shifting away from a priority to a secondary option. On this slide, you can see the population pyramid for Europe from 2018. Take note of the narrow portions of the population pyramid, people above the age of 65 and people below the age of 25. In between are the children and grandchildren of Europe's baby boomers, who have had considerably fewer children of their own. What this means for Europe's future is that some European nations will continue to experience lower fertility rates and inch closer to zero population growth as fertility rates fall below the replacement level of 2 children per couple. A lot of the changes to Europe's demographics have been attributed to the great changes that have come to Europe's women's lives. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, the advent of second-wave feminism in the latter part of the 20th century shifted women from becoming young wives and mothers to women holding college degrees and professional careers. On this slide, I aim to convey to you what exactly is meant by second-wave feminism and to show you its impact on Europe's demographic changes. Second-wave feminism occurred in Europe between the 1960s and the 1980s, as it did in the United States. In contrast to first-wave feminism, which focused on women's suffrage and property rights, second wave feminism focused on a broader range of issues to include things like sexuality and sexual orientation, women in the family, women in the workplace, reproductive rights, de facto inequalities, and official legal inequalities. It focused on critiquing the patriarchal institutions and cultural practices throughout society. It also drew attention to the issues of domestic violence and marital rape, engendered rape crisis centers and women's shelters, and brought about changes in custody laws and divorce law. Second wave feminism led to new modes of marriage, partnership, motherhood, divorce, and reproduction, which gave women more options in their personal lives and more control over their bodies. New modes of managing reproduction would include birth control pills, abortion rights, and scientific means of fertilization for women and couples who suffered from infertility. One second wave feminist, French writer Simone de Beauvoir, defined the existence of women as a secondary sex in her published work, The Second Sex, in 1949. She wrote, "It is perfectly natural for the future woman to feel indignant at the limitations posed upon her by her sex. The real question is not why she would reject them. The problem is rather to understand why she accepts them." In many ways, the second wave feminism that took place in the decades after Beauvoir's publication counteracted the limitations posed on women in a patriarchal society, as through women's actions and decisions, it rejected Europe's long-held patriarchal traditions. As significant that second wave feminism was for changing women's roles in Europe's society and ultimately impacting Europe's demographics in the latter part of the 20th century, it is to be noted that first wave feminism also had its reach on women's lives, even into the post-Cold War era in Europe. As mentioned previously, first wave feminism mostly focused on women's suffrage. Granted, many suffragists and first wave feminists did attach themselves to issues that concerned women, such as temperance, anti-war protesting, and anti-armaments production in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But the greatest achievement for them was after World War I, when European nations began to grant women the right to vote. On the map on this slide, you can see that after 1914, as indicated in light blue, European nations began to overwhelmingly enfranchise women. Notice in a lot of southern European countries, where the Roman Catholic Church was still very influential, women's suffrage did not occur until after World War II. Many southern European nations with a long tradition of Roman Catholicism continued with traditions of patriarchy that hindered first wave feminism, and would also hinder second wave feminism later in the 20th century. With European women now more involved in Europe's politics than ever before, policies that directly affected women became a greater priority than ever before. In short, without first wave feminism and the achievement of women's suffrage, second wave feminism would not have happened in the timeliness and magnitude as it did. As more women were enfranchised through the work of first wave feminists, elected officials who now had to represent their female constituency could change traditional policies that restricted women. Policies that restricted women in marriage, divorce, property, business ownership, and abortion rights all became targets of second wave feminism as pressure increased on Europe's elected leaders to begin to compromise on such traditional restrictive policies. On this slide, you see a map that shows the member states of the European Union and the status of their abortion laws as of 2007. Indicated in purple, these are the European states that allow for legal abortions with very few limitations. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, through the success of both first and second wave feminism, women attained high political office and increased their representation in legislative bodies in many nations. The first to blaze the trail of women ascending to the head of state was the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, who became England's first female prime minister and served in that capacity from 1979 until 1990. Although her politics tended to challenge England's welfare state, and historians conclude that she did little to advance women's status and rights in England during her tenure, her ascension to the prime ministry definitely paved the way for more European women to reach parallel levels. The 10 women shown on this slide hold elected or appointed positions of president or prime minister in European governments as of the year 2020. To be noted, I did not include Theresa May's photo here, as she resigned in 2019. May was the second female prime minister in England's history. Increased rights for women paved the way for increased rights for LGBTQ peoples in Europe. As of 2019, these nations indicated in 2 different shades of green allow for same-sex marriages and same-sex civil unions. After World War II, Western European states were increasingly influenced by American economic, technological, political, and cultural influences as the Cold War set in. The relationship established between America and Europe's Western democracies was characterized by increased imports of U.S. technology and popular culture into Europe after World War II. In a lot of ways, American technologies, including communication technologies, and American culture, such as rock and roll music, and American businesses that produce popular consumer products, such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola, reached European culture in greater waves. After 1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the potential for economic and cultural reunification between Eastern and Western European states, Americanization of Europe's culture reached an even greater level. Communication technologies such as the telephone, radio, and television had all contributed to Europe's Americanization and globalization. But after 1991, the personal computer, cell phones, and the World Wide Web, Europe's Americanization and globalization definitively expanded. On this slide, I share some imagery of the forces of Americanization on European culture in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. The image in the top left corner is of Disney Paris, which opened in 1992, and today receives over 14 million visitors each year. McDonald's has been a part of Europe's culture for quite a while, as it was introduced to France in 1972. However, French menus of late have tried to preserve French culture and cuisine by offering French-inspired menu items in French McDonald's franchises. The photos to the bottom left of this slide show the recently marketed McBaguette from 2011. To the bottom right of the slide is an image of the first McDonald's that opened in Moscow, Russia in 1990, amidst the economic liberalization policies of Gorbachev's perestroika. Today, there are more than 600 McDonald's franchises throughout the Russian Federation. Coca-Cola has been another company that is marketed to and produced in the European states. The image to the top right is of the Coca-Cola Christmas truck, which made its rounds through several European cities while marketing Coca-Cola products and merchandise during the holiday season. Here, the truck is in London, England in 2018. The second half of this presentation will address Europe's post-Cold War tendencies of political, economic, and cultural unity. However, this presentation will also challenge that tendency to show how Europe's post-Cold War existence may be dichotomous, and as much as it may be characterized by political, economic, and cultural unity, that there are forces of disunity at work as well. This slide and the next several slides address post-Cold War Europe as a time and place of unity. Ways it is a time of unity include the reunification of Germany in 1990, the founding of the European Union in 1993, the establishment of the Eurozone in 1999, and the increased membership of the European Union, with many former Soviet satellite states of Eastern Europe having joined the European Union after 1995 and after 2004. Recall, during the Cold War, Europe was an ideologically, politically, militarily, and economically divided continent. That division played out more locally in post-war Germany and post-war Berlin. The division of Germany lasted between 1945 and 1990 and was originally based on the Yalta Conference from February of 1945, nearing the end of World War II. Ultimately, Germany would be divided among the Allied powers, with West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, being established in 1949, which received Marshall Plan money and was an American ally throughout the Cold War. The establishment of East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, was also established in 1949 and was a member of the Warsaw Pact and a Soviet satellite state throughout the Cold War. Recall, there were significant points of Cold War division that pertained to Germany's Iron Curtain divide. For example, the Soviet blockade early during the Cold War and the English and American response of the Berlin airlift between 1948 and 1949, captured in the image to the left. Later on, the reignited tensions between East and West Germany and the prominence of East Berliners defecting to West Berlin caused the Berlin Crisis of 1961, which resulted in the construction of the Berlin Wall. In the image to the right, you can see the militarized scene of Checkpoint Charlie between the American and Soviet sectors of Berlin, which intensified the Berlin Crisis. In this photo, you can see the beginning of the construction of the Berlin Wall near the Brandenburg Gate in 1961. The Berlin Wall would remain as a dividing point between East and West Berlin until 1989. In this slide, there are two iconic photos of the night the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Both East and West Berliners chipped away at the divisive structure in anticipation of reunifying with friends and family members caught on opposing sides of two global ideologies. In 1990, both East and West Germany politically reunified, and the Chancellor of former West Germany, Helmut Kohl, retained his position as the German Chancellor, as the former East Germany was absorbed into West Germany's political system. He would remain the Chancellor of the unified Germany until 1998. Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder would be his successor, who would remain as Chancellor until 2005. Since 2005, Angela Merkel has held the position of Chancellor of Germany. Europe has seemingly been moving toward economic unity for a lot of its modern history. In fact, some of the economic agreements that were made as far back as the early 19th century can be considered the earliest steps in Europe's economic unification. However, it would be after World War II, and then even more intently after 1991, when European states really began to set aside nationalist rivalries in favor of economic and political integration. This slide shares some of the historical steps taken throughout Europe's late modern history that carried Europe to greater economic integration. Arguably, the first step toward economic integration was the establishment of the Zollverein, a German customs union established back in 1834. The customs union, prior to Germany's unification, was under the control of the Prussian government, which helped Prussia become the most economically and commercially developed state in the German Confederation. The Zollverein was also instrumental in German unification and Germany's leadership in industrialization and commercialization in the latter half of the 19th century. Free trade agreements also began to result in greater economic cooperation and integration, as barriers to trade, labor, production, and distribution of goods and resources began to be removed. As early as the repeal of the Corn Laws in the United Kingdom in 1846, and the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty of 1860 between the United Kingdom and France, Free trade was allowing for greater economic integration between two of Europe's most industrially developed nations. After World War II, in an effort to cooperatively address the continent's industrial and consumer demands of coal and steel, the European Coal and Steel Community was established in 1953. In 1957, the European Common Market was established to extend free trade agreements among Western European nations. The European Common Market was the precursor to the eventual development of the European Union in 1993. On this slide, I have included the European Union's stated goals, which are as follows: to promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its citizens; to offer freedom, security, and justice without internal borders; for sustainable development based on balanced economic growth and price stability, a highly competitive market economy with full employment and social progress and environmental protection; to combat social exclusion and discrimination; to promote scientific and technological progress; to enhance economic, social, and territorial cohesion and solidarity among EU countries; to respect its rich cultural and linguistic diversity; and to establish an economic and monetary union whose currency is the euro. On this slide, I have provided the European Union's common values, which are expected to be upheld by the European Union Parliament, the governments and their leaders of the European member nation states, and the European citizens of all member states. Those values are as follows: human dignity. Human dignity is inviolable. It must be respected, protected, and constitutes the real basis of fundamental rights. Freedom. Freedom of movement gives citizens the right to move and reside freely within the Union. Individual freedoms such as respect for private life, freedom of thought, religion, assembly, expression, and information are protected by the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights. Democracy. The functioning of the EU is founded on representative democracy. Being a European citizen also means enjoying political rights. Every adult EU citizen has the right to stand as a candidate and to vote in elections to the European Parliament. EU citizens have the right to stand as candidate and to vote in their country of residence or in their country of origin. Equality. Equality is about equal rights for all citizens before the law. The principle of equality between women and men underpins all European policies and is the basis for European integration. It applies in all areas. The principle of equal pay for equal work became part of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Although inequality still exists, the EU has made significant progress. The EU is based on the rule of law. Everything the EU does is founded on treaties, voluntarily and democratically agreed by its EU countries. Law and justice are upheld by an independent judiciary. The EU countries gave final jurisdiction to the European Court of Justice, which judgments have to be respected by all. And human rights. Human rights are protected by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. These cover the right to be free from discrimination on the basis of sex, racial or ethnic origin, religion or belief, disability, age or sexual orientation, the right to the protection of your personal data, and or the right to get access to justice. This slide shows a map of the 28 European Union member states as of 2016. Today, there are 27 European Union member states. The Eurozone, which includes all of the European states that officially accept the euro as their currency, was established in 1999. Not all EU members accepted the euro as their currency and opted to retain their national currencies. England, prior to Brexit, when it was a member of the European Union, never joined the Eurozone and opted to keep the British pound as its national currency. However, some non-Eurozone states within the European Union have lax policies regarding the use of the euro in their nation. For example, many vendors, restaurants, and stores in the marketplaces of Budapest, Hungary, accept euros in spite of the fact that the forint is their national currency. Currently, one US dollar is equivalent to 0.92 euro, in case you're planning a trip to Europe anytime soon. The last few slides of this presentation attempts to address the forces of disunity occurring in post-Cold War Europe. Listed on this slide are ways post-Cold War Europe is a place and time of disunity. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, numerous points of disunity occurred in Europe. The first was the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, which officially ended the Soviet trade bloc and inaugurated a host of newly independent nations that were former Soviet satellite states or Soviet republics. Nationalist and separatist movements, predicated on the desires for specific nationalist and ethnic groups to achieve their political and economic autonomy, also intensified after 1991, with the Chechen Wars between Chechnya and the Russian Federation between 1994 and 1996. After the end of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet satellite state, Czechoslovakia, separated into two states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, in 1993. Also, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, one of the most violent points of post-Cold War Europe's divisiveness was in the division of Yugoslavia between 1991 and 2008. Out of the breakup of Yugoslavia, North Macedonia, Slovenia, and Croatia gained their independence in 1991 after the Croatian War of Independence from 1991 to 1995. Bosnia-Herzegovina gained its independence in 1992 through the Bosnian War between 1992 and 1995. After that point, the nation-state of Serbia and some pockets of Bosnian Serbs within Bosnia-Herzegovina were still committed to the continuation of Yugoslavia. Eventually, Montenegro gained its independence from Serbia in 2006, and Kosovo gained its independence from Serbia in 2008, nearly a decade after the disastrous and bloody conflict of the Kosovo War between 1998 and 1999. On the other side of Europe, there is the continued Basque and Catalan separatists movements who wish to break free from Spain. And of course, arguably the greatest sign of European disunity since 1991, Brexit, or Britain's exit from the European Union, which began with the passage of a referendum in 2016 and was finalized in 2020. On this slide, the map shows the former Soviet satellite states and Soviet republics that all became independent at the end of the Cold War, or just after the end of the Cold War. Here are 8 former Soviet satellites and Soviet allies in Europe that unaligned themselves with Russia prior to 1991. The earliest was Yugoslavia in 1948 and Albania in 1961. But the other 6 happened between 1989 and 1991. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria all removed their communist parties during glasnost between 1989 and 1991, and thus the long-held economic and political unity of the Soviet Bloc in Eastern Europe was no more. Here is a map of some newly formed nation-states in Asia and Europe after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The dissolution of the Soviet Union also saw 8 former Soviet republics in Asia gain their independence in 1991, to include Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. There were 6 former Soviet republics in Europe that gained their independence in 1991, to include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. The dissolution of the Soviet Union and Russia's new status in Europe and the world has not come with complete Russian acceptance. In fact, the Russian Federation has made several military actions against separatist populations within Russia's borders and against former Soviet republics that border Russia. The next few slides address the locations where the Russian Federation has waged war since 1991. The Chechen Wars between 1994 and 1996 were waged by Russian President Boris Yeltsin against Chechen separatists in the southwestern region of Russia. Chechnya is an example of a nationalistic and separatist movement declared its independence in 1991, but the Russian Federation sought to force Chechnya to remain a part of the Federation. Chechens are predominantly Islamic, ethnic, and religious minorities living on the Russian side of the Caucasus Mountains. Chechen rebels have successfully defended themselves from Russian military occupation over the years, and have also been responsible for acts of terror against Russian targets, as in the case of the Moscow theater hostage crisis back in 2002. Russia did not rest with its wars against the separatists of Chechnya, as under Vladimir Putin, multiple acts of military aggression against former Soviet republics have taken place in the early 21st century. For example, the Russo-Georgia War in 2008 was prompted by Putin's desires to control ports in the Black Sea in Georgia's sovereign territory, and to control South Ossetia's access to natural gas. Putin also waged the Russo-Ukraine War in 2014, as Russian tanks rolled into the Ukraine in order to control the Crimea Peninsula and other ports in the Black Sea through annexing sovereign Ukraine territory. Pro-Russian Ukrainians have exacerbated problems for the Ukrainian government's handling of Russia's military mobilization, as many of them support Putin's military actions and even push for a reunification of Ukraine with Russia. Not every point of division within Europe since 1991 has been characterized by conflict and military mobilization. For example, the breakup of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia occurred without conflict. On this slide is a map of Czechoslovakia as it was established in 1919 after the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. It would remain a sovereign nation until its dissolution in 1993. In 1993, the dissolution of Czechoslovakia occurred amicably, as Czechs and Slovaks enjoyed their own nationalist aspirations and self-determination through the establishment of an independent Czech Republic and an independent Slovakia. However, at the time that Czechoslovakia was dissolving peacefully, Yugoslavia was dividing through long, expansive, brutal conflict. The map on this slide shows the establishment of Yugoslavia, all the way back to 1919 as well. Yugoslavia was created out of the Treaty of Versailles and specifically out of the dissolution of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. This was the closest thing to self-determination that the various Slavic peoples and ethnic groups would achieve for the vast majority of the 20th century. Yugoslavia did avoid coming under Soviet control for the duration of the Cold War, but its central command was housed in Belgrade, the capital city of Serbia. Basically, the Serbs saw themselves as the lead nationalists and ethnic group of all the Slavic peoples in Yugoslavia. And when the Cold War ended and the nationalist aspirations of non-Serbian peoples was awakened, the Serbian military fought hard to try and keep Yugoslavia intact, along with Serbian political and military dominance within Yugoslavia. Throughout the 1990s, 3 locations that sought their independence from Yugoslavia yielded some of the most destructive conflicts since the end of World War II. Those locations were Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. As nationalist aspirations grew for Croats, Bosnians and Bosniaks, and Kosovars, Serbs and Bosnian Serbs perpetrated against these groups in a series of bloody Yugoslav wars. The Croatian War for Independence lasted between 1991 and 1995. The Bosnian War lasted between 1992 and 1995 and involved Serbian and Bosnian Serbian acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing against Muslim Bosnians, or Bosniaks, living in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Kosovo War lasted between 1998 and 1999, and it too was characterized by Serbian and Bosnian Serbian acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing against ethnic Albanians, specifically Muslim Albanians living in Kosovo. Few Serbian leaders have been tried and convicted for crimes of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the Yugoslav wars. Two of the Serbian leaders who were deemed most responsible for the actions of ethnic cleansing against Muslim Albanians and Bosniaks were Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic and Bosnian Serb military commander Ratko Mladic. Milosevic, pictured to the left, was arrested in 2001 and subsequently put on trial. He died while on trial in 2006. Ratko Mladic, pictured to the right, was convicted of genocide and sentenced to life in prison in 2017. Nationalist aspirations in Europe go beyond the former Soviet satellites and republics of Eastern Europe, and beyond the newly formed republics of former Yugoslavia in southeastern Europe. Separatist movements in Spain gained momentum over the last 30 years, with Catalan and Basque peoples pushing for their independence from Spain. On this slide, you can see the locations of Basque and Catalan people who straddle the Pyrenees between France and Spain. The Basque National Liberation Movement violently fought against Francisco Franco's Spain until his death in 1975, and continued its actions through 2011. Catalan independence failed due to failed referendums in 2014 and 2017. However, the movement has not lost momentum in spite of those setbacks, as Catalan separatists vie for autonomy to this day. Finally, the post-Cold War period in European history has been characterized by a relatively new threat of political and economic disunity, and that is the breaking up of the European Union. This was spawned by the actions taken by the citizens and the government of England in 2016, who in a successful referendum decided to begin the process of leaving the European Union. This movement became known as Brexit, or Britain's exit from the European Union. One criticism of the EU from its member nations, citizens and governments, is the difficulty they have in balancing national sovereignty with the lofty responsibilities of membership in an economic and political union. The stagnant European Union's economy throughout the second decade of the 21st century created interest in the UK leaving the European Union. Furthermore, the challenge to England's sovereignty and the ensuing migration crisis between 2015 and 2016 made evident the rise in nationalism among the English voters. The inability of the Conservative and Labour parties to appeal to its constituents on the needs to remain a part of the European Union ultimately was reflected in the 2016 referendum. In the year 2020, Brexit was finalized, and it spotlighted the potential for other EU member states to follow England's pattern. A lot of southern European states have had disastrous economies and see leaving the European Union as a potential solution to their economic hardships. This sentiment is demonstrated in the political cartoon to the left of this slide, as many European Union members consider their economic well-being and political national sovereignty as being challenged by the requirements of the European Union's political cooperation and economic integration. So how do historians capture Europe's historical narrative over the past 30 years? Is it a narrative of progressive change, consumer success, societal and gender liberalism? Is it a narrative of unity and oneness in spite of the array of languages, ethnicities, religious groups, and nation states that make up Europe's human landscape? Is it a narrative of disunity and tension and conflict in spite of the forces of political and economic cooperation and integration that exist within Europe? Is it a narrative of shared economic benefits for all of Europe's citizens? Or is it a narrative of the denial of benefits for those not part of a particular national identity? I think the most accurate historical narrative falls somewhere in between the answers to these thought-provoking questions, which perhaps would tell a narrative of a Europe as a dichotomous and complex experience in the post-Cold War world.